Congressman Ted Lieu leaned forward, elbows braced on the committee table, voice measured, face unreadable. "Ms. Crockett," he said, pausing just long enough to sharpen the blade, "what exactly qualifies you to sit at this table?" The sentence sliced through the air. A beat of silence, then another. Jaws tightened, pen stopped moving, someone in the back row exhaled audibly. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She held his gaze steady, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. This wasn't a question. It was a gauntlet dressed in civility, dripping in condescension. In that instant, the entire chamber became a stage. Not for policy, not for justice, but for power. The unspoken kind, the kind that asks not, "What do you bring to this work?" but "Do you even belong here?" Lieu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The implication thundered louder than any yell. "You're not one of us. Prove you deserve the mic." Viewers at home leaned in. Social media threads lit up within seconds. "Did Ted Lieu really just question her credentials on camera?" one user typed. "He picked the wrong one," wrote another. But in the room, no one moved. Crockett's hands rested flat on the table. Calm, her lips pressed just slightly, curled upward not into a smile, but something deeper, something unreadable. She knew this moment, not just in politics, but in life, in courtrooms, in campaign rooms, in every space where being there meant having to justify it over and over again. Across the table, Lieu waited, confident, maybe even smug. She tilted her head slightly. "What qualifies you?" The question echoed, not just for her, but for every person watching who had ever been told, "You're too loud, too young, too different, too much," who had ever been asked to shrink, to soften, to explain. But Jasmine Crockett didn't shrink. She inhaled slowly, the tension rippled, and just as Ted Lieu's chair creaked with anticipation, she spoke. But what happened next left the entire country in disbelief. Credentials are currency in Washington, spoken and unspoken. Not just degrees or resumes, but the quiet codes of who is meant to lead, who gets deference, who gets doubted, and who gets dismissed. That's what made Ted Lieu's questions so loaded. On paper, both he and Jasmine Crockett had earned their place. Lieu, a seasoned congressman from California, decorated veteran, Harvard-educated lawyer, known for his sharp wit and digital savvy. Crockett, a Texas firebrand, civil rights attorney, former public defender, forged in grassroots grit and local battles that shaped lives far from the marble halls of Congress. But this was not paper. This was perception. And in that moment, Lieu wasn't just questioning a colleague. He was echoing the oldest test in American power. Can you prove you belong in this room? To some, Lieu's inquiry seemed procedural. Innocent, even. But to many watching, especially black women, first-generation leaders, immigrants, and organizers from communities like Crockett's, it rang louder than any dog whistle. It was the thinly veiled doubt that has followed outsiders for generations. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just answering for herself. She was carrying the weight of South Dallas, where housing injustice and overpolicing are daily battles. She was carrying the courtroom battles where she defended those left behind. She was carrying every voter who said, "You speak for us," even when the world doesn't want to listen. Lieu, for all his progressive credentials, for all his public stances on inclusion, had slipped into a familiar role, not of villainy in the cartoon sense, but of gatekeeping. The kind that says, "We like your voice, but only if it follows our rules." And that's why this moment mattered. It wasn't about two Democrats disagreeing. It was about an invisible border between old power and new voices, between institution and insurgency, between asking for validation and standing as it. Jasmine Crockett didn't come to Congress to ask for permission. She came to change the conversation. And in this exchange, something else cracked open. The realization that even allies can be challengers. That the fight for representation doesn't end with a swearing in. It starts with who gets believed. This wasn't just a spat in a hearing. It was a proxy war for every room where a woman of color walks in and is expected to explain how she got the key. And still, Jasmine didn't flinch. Because to her, the answer wasn't a list of degrees or offices held. It was in the work, the battles fought, the community served. She was, in every way, the proof. And you'll see how this single moment cracks open a much bigger fault line in Washington, a divide between those who believe authority must be earned through acceptance, and those who believe authority can be born from struggle. Because just as the question settled in the air, the hero found her voice, but the villain wasn't finished yet. Ted Lieu didn't arrive in Washington as a nobody. His story, in many ways, is the classic arc that America loves to celebrate. An immigrant kid who worked his way through hardship, joined the Air Force, earned his stripes through service, then climbed into politics with a reputation for sharp intellect and sharper discipline. Colleagues saw him as methodical, strategic, a man who studied the rulebook until he knew every line by heart. He built his career on precision, every word chosen, every argument measured, every public moment crafted like a chess move. A veteran, a lawyer, a congressman from California with a resume that made even his seniors nod with respect. Ted Lieu was not the type to stumble. When he spoke, he rarely misspoke. When he asked a question in committee, it was almost always by design. That was part of his mystique, the sense that everything he did carried intention. Even his calm felt calculated, a deliberate contrast to the chaos that often swirled through congressional hearings. To the public, especially to progressives, Lieu had built a brand as one of the sharp-tongued warriors of the Trump era, firing off viral posts, embarrassing bad-faith actors, and becoming a minor celebrity of political Twitter. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had survived real battles both in uniform and in the political arena and didn't feel threatened easily. His colleagues often joked that if a hearing turned heated, Lieu was the one you watched for the knockout blow. But underneath the polish and the accolades, there was another side, not sinister, not cruel, but steeped in the old rhythms of Washington power. A side that believed credentials were the armor that separated chaos from order. That rigorous training, elite education, and years spent inside the machinery of government created a hierarchy, a quiet, unspoken ladder. Not everyone had climbed it. Not everyone knew how. So when he leaned into that microphone and asked Jasmine Crockett to spell out what qualified her to sit beside him, it wasn't shouted aggression. It was almost effortless, almost reflexive, the kind of challenge thrown by someone who had spent years guarding the gates, perhaps without even realizing he'd become a gatekeeper. He wasn't trying to humiliate her. At least in his mind, he was. He was doing what he'd done countless times when the new and untested stepped into the arena, pressing them, probing them, making them articulate their worth. In Lieu's worldview, questions like his maintained order, standards, stability. But in a chamber shaped increasingly by voices that didn't come from Ivy League corridors or traditional ladders of power, the question hit differently. What Lieu saw as a standard test, others saw as a thinly veiled dismissal. And for a progressive-leaning America watching online, for people who knew what it felt like to walk into rooms where they weren't expected to exist, let alone excel, his calm tone didn't soften the blow. It sharpened it. Because Ted Lieu's credentials had never been questioned. Not really. No one asked him why his service mattered or whether his legal career counted or if he'd earned his seat. The uniform, the degrees, the offices held these had spoken for him. The system recognized his path. It was familiar, comfortable, legible. And in that familiarity grew a blind spot. He didn't see how differently the question landed on someone whose path had not been laid out by institutions, but carved out of resistance and survival. Someone whose legitimacy wasn't handed down, but constantly challenged by courts, by voters, by skeptics who believed experience had to look a certain way before it counted. Lieu believed in the hierarchy. Crockett believed in the people who sent her. Their collision was inevitable. As he waited for her answer, his posture relaxed, almost casual. His fingers tapped lightly on the table, a subtle signal of confidence. He had asked variations of this question hundreds of times. It had rattled lesser opponents. It had exposed unprepared newcomers. It had worked. But this time, something was different. Not because Jasmine Crockett lacked credentials, she had them in abundance. Not because she was intimidated, she was. But because the room itself was changing. Washington was being reshaped by voices who didn't come to be validated. They came to validate their communities. And the gatekeepers, even well-meaning ones, were bumping into a new kind of resolve. Ted Lieu didn't see it yet. He couldn't. He was leaning on instincts built over decades in institutions that rewarded his path and rarely challenged it. He thought he controlled the tempo of this hearing, the arc of this moment, the weight of his question. But he didn't know that across the aisle someone had prepared for this moment quietly, deliberately. Jasmine Crockett didn't come from power. She came from purpose. Born in St. Louis, raised by educators, she grew up knowing the difference between surviving and thriving and what it meant when whole communities were denied the right to do either. Her roots weren't just in classrooms or quiet neighborhoods. They were in courtrooms, in marches, in city council meetings where voices were silenced unless someone fought to raise them again. She didn't attend the most elite institutions, but she earned her law degree at the Thurgood Marshall School of Law A Place, named after a man who once argued cases that shook the walls of American injustice. It was there she shaped the way she thought about the law, not as an abstraction, but as a weapon that could be reclaimed and aimed upward toward power. After graduation, Jasmine didn't chase the high salaries. She went straight into criminal defense and civil rights, representing those most easily forgotten, young black men railroaded by the system, mothers caught in housing traps, fathers who couldn't afford bail for nonviolent charges, people who had been told in court and in life that their voice didn't count. She stood in front of judges and prosecutors and panels again and again saying they deserved to be heard. It wasn't glamorous. It was hard, thankless, draining, but it was hers. Texas wasn't an easy place to do this kind of work, but she stayed. She built a name in Dallas not through connections, but by becoming the person people called when all other doors slammed shut. In her work, credibility wasn't about prestige. It was about consistency. Credentials didn't mean degrees framed on the wall. It meant trust earned one client at a time, one case at a time, one voice at a time. When George Floyd was murdered and the country erupted, she wasn't watching it on the news. She was in the streets. She was marching. She was speaking. And soon, people began to say what they always say in moments like this: we need someone like her in office. But Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for permission. In 2020, she ran for the Texas House. It was a long shot. She wasn't backed by old money or legacy machines. But she won. And once inside, she didn't play quiet. She made headlines as one of the Democratic lawmakers who fled Texas in protest of voter suppression bills, refusing to allow her state to silence the people she represented. That was the kind of credential she carried: defiance in the name of justice, obedience only to the people who sent her. In 2022, when Congressman Johnson retired after nearly 30 years in office, a rare opening emerged in Texas's 30th congressional district, a deeply rooted black district that had never been represented by anyone but a black Democrat. The establishment expected a traditional successor, but the community wanted someone who had already been fighting for them. She won, and suddenly, Jasmine Crockett, civil rights lawyer, daughter of educators, defender of the unheard, walked through the doors of the U.S. Capitol as a sitting member of Congress. Not everyone welcomed her. In the marbled corridors of D.C., where influence often wears tailored suits and speaks with academic restraint, her boldness stood out. Her hair, her cadence, her unapologetic clapbacks on social media. She didn't adjust to the room. She brought her room with her. And for that, she became a target, not overtly, not always intentionally, but in sideways comments, quiet condescension, smirks when she spoke up, not because she lacked experience, but because her experience didn't look like theirs. So when Ted Lieu asked her what qualified her to be there, it wasn't just a slight. It was a summary of every assumption made by every gatekeeper she'd ever faced. And still, she didn't rise out of anger. She didn't lash out. Because Crockett had learned something in every courtroom and council room and legislative fight she'd survived. The most powerful answers are often the quietest ones. She knew who she was. She knew what she'd done. And she had one answer ready, and it was going to change everything. Not just because it would silence the room, but because it would reframe the question entirely. Not, do you deserve this seat? But why do you think you get to ask? The moment arrived, the question landed. And the tone of the chamber shifted. The air in the committee room tightened. The hum of side conversations vanished. Reporters froze mid-note. Cameras zoomed in. Ted Lieu's words still lingered, sharp and deliberate. What exactly qualifies you to be here? He leaned back slightly, hands clasped, not smug, not overt, but confident, the kind of confidence built over years of being unchallenged in rooms like this. It was the tone of someone who believed the silence meant agreement. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She sat upright, composed, one hand resting lightly on her notes, the other flat on the wood. The question was hanging between them, almost daring her to react. She didn't take the bait. Her voice came steady at first, quiet even. She didn't match his energy, she controlled it. "Congressman," she said, tilting her head slightly, "when you ask me that question, you're not just asking me. You're asking every voter who sent me here." A ripple moved through the room, barely audible, but visible in the glances exchanged. Someone shifted in their seat. A pen clicked, stopped. Lieu raised an eyebrow. "It's a fair question. We're tasked with vetting ideas, expertise, credentials matter." Crockett nodded slowly. "I agree. Credentials do matter. But let's be clear, credentials come in many forms. I've been a public defender. I've been a civil rights attorney. I've stood between the law and the people it was crushing. I've walked into jail cells to represent men the system forgot." Her tone sharpened just slightly. A rising cadence, not aggressive but firm. Every word landed with precision. "I didn't just study law. I've used it to fight and win." Lieu leaned forward again. "That's admirable, but fighting isn't legislating. Policy requires more than passion. It takes training, discipline, structure." Crockett interrupted, not with volume but with stillness. "You think I don't know structure?" she said. "Let me tell you what structure looks like. It looks like trying to pass reform in a state where they want to jail women for health care. It looks like being gerrymandered into silence. It looks like watching your colleagues flee the state to block voter suppression because that's the only option left." The room quieted again. One member across the aisle looked up from their phone. Another leaned in. Lieu's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air. Crockett continued, her voice now carrying the full weight of conviction. "My community didn't send me here to be quiet. They sent me because they know what I've done, because they know the stakes, and because they know that when someone finally gets a seat at this table, they shouldn't have to audition for their right to speak." Lieu opened his mouth to respond, but she pressed on. "I didn't come here asking for permission. I came with the authority of the people I serve." Each word was deliberate, each sentence stacking on the last. He tried again. "No one's denying your experience." She cut in, and this time the energy changed. "But you are," she said. "You may not mean to, but when you ask me to list my qualifications in front of cameras, when you ask as if you don't already know who I am and what I've done, you're not asking out of process. You're asking out of presumption." The room was still. Crockett leaned in, matching his posture now. "And that's the difference between us, Congressman. You see credentials as a resume. I see them as responsibility. And I carry mine every time I open my mouth in defense of the people who never get a seat in this room." Lieu looked back at her, no words this time, just the sound of shuffling paper, the tension thick enough to cut. And then, when the room thought the question was done, that's when she dropped the line that altered the whole course of this hearing. There was a pause, not awkward, but intentional, the kind that follows a shot fired and the whole room waiting to hear if it hit. Jasmine Crockett took one final breath. Then she let it all go. "You want to talk credentials?" she said, eyes locked on Ted Lieu. "Let's talk." There was no paper in front of her, no rehearsed lines, just memory and fire. "I didn't inherit a legacy. I wasn't groomed for this. I built it. I built every inch of my credibility from the courtroom floor, defending people no one else wanted to touch." Her voice wasn't raised, but it didn't need to be. "I've defended young black men with 3 strikes before they even saw a judge. I've sat across from prosecutors who treated poverty like guilt. I've watched mothers sob in courtrooms where their sons were statistics. You think a certificate teaches you how to handle that?" Lieu's fingers twitched slightly. The camera caught it. Crockett leaned forward. "I've been screamed at by sheriffs, locked out of records, threatened, investigated, and I kept showing up, because my community couldn't afford for me not to." Her tone sharpened, cracking through the formality of the chamber like thunder. "I fought cases no one thought I could win, and I won them, because the people I defended weren't numbers to me. They were neighbors, teachers, veterans, fathers, sons. And when they walked out free, they called me their lawyer, not because I had degrees, but because I didn't give up on them." A low murmur rippled through the back rows of the room. Someone whispered. A staffer took off their glasses slowly. The tension was no longer between Crockett and Lieu, it had spread. "You want to talk about structure, Congressman?" she continued. "I've been in rooms where the only structure was injustice, where every rule bent against the people I came to protect. And still I didn't back down. I used the same laws meant to crush us to fight for us." Lieu shifted in his seat. It was subtle but noticeable. His jaw tightened, his posture less relaxed now. Crockett didn't stop. I didn't go viral on Twitter for clever lines. I didn't sit on cable news panels giving opinions. I went where the fights were ugly, where the media wouldn't follow, where my people bled and no one listened, and I showed up. Camera lights flickered, a reporter's phone buzzed, another checked the live feed. Then she dropped it. So when you ask what qualifies me to be here, I want you to remember something. My credentials. They're not just framed on a wall, they live in every name I helped clear. Every eviction I stopped. Every protester I defended. Every family that could sleep one more night in their home because I stood up when no one else would. There was a beat of silence. Then the gallery leaned in. One congresswoman blinked, surprised. Another smirked not with amusement but recognition. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just defending herself. She was delivering a master class in who gets to define worth. Lieu opened his mouth as if to interject, but the moment was gone. It belonged to her now. Crockett turned slightly, addressing the full room. Some of you think this place only belongs to a certain kind of story. Ivy Leagues, internships, donor dinners, that's fine. But let me be crystal clear, that's not the only way in. She tapped the desk once softly. I am the other way. The words hit with the force of a closing gavel. Aides in the back exchanged glances. A camera zoomed in close. On social media, the clip had already gone up. A 29-second soundbite captioned, I am the other way. Retweets, duets, hashtags forming. Crockett clapback. Credentials redefined. I am the other way. Even the opposing side, normally stiff and disinterested, had shifted their posture. Because something real had just broken through the script. This wasn't theater. This was reckoning. Lieu, to his credit, didn't lash out, but he no longer looked certain. His eyes darted just once toward the committee chair. Looking for what exactly? Rescue? Reset? He would never say. Crockett leaned back, but her presence only grew. I didn't come here to meet expectations, she said, voice lower now, almost reflective. I came to raise them. For every girl who's ever been told she has to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. For every community told to wait their turn. For every voice someone tried to quiet with a question like the one you just asked me. And then, just like that, she stopped. No dramatic finish, no forced applause line, just silence and stillness. Because she knew. She had already won the moment. Not through fury, but through clarity. Through truth spoken so plainly, so directly, it left no room for rebuttal. Lieu sat quietly, nodding once whether in concession or calculation, no one could tell. But the energy had shifted. The gallery wasn't looking at him anymore. They were looking at her. The hero who didn't raise her voice, but who raised the stakes. But as the echoes faded, the aftershocks were just beginning. The clip hit social media within minutes. 39 seconds, clipped mid-hearing, captioned simply, I am the other way. By the end of the hour, it had crossed 2 million views. By sundown, hashtags were trending. Crockett creds, Lieu challenge, mic drop moment, she belongs. Progressive commentators seized it instantly. What we just witnessed, one YouTuber declared to a live stream audience of 300,000, wasn't a clapback, it was a realignment. The moment that started with a challenge to credentials had become a referendum on who defines legitimacy and why. TikTok exploded with duets. Black women in lab coats, teachers in classrooms, mothers holding bobbies, all lip-syncing the same phrase, I am the other way. On cable news, the divide deepened. A panel on MSNBC called it a watershed moment in representational politics. Fox framed it as performative outrage. CNN asked if it was, a sign that internal party discipline is breaking down. But none of that captured the ground-level response. Local radio in Dallas lit up with callers. One man, a retired city bus driver, said, she didn't just speak for her, she spoke for us. Every time I had to prove I was enough for someone who thought they knew better. A teacher in Oak Cliff told her students to watch the exchange for homework. This, she said, is how you show up when they don't expect you to. Even on conservative talk shows, the tone shifted from scoffing to caution. Like her or not, one host said, this woman knows how to hold a room, and right now the room is listening. Meanwhile, Crockett's team fielded press requests from NPR, Rolling Stone, even Vanity Fair. But she didn't jump on the interview circuit. She stayed steady, disciplined, focused. "I didn't say what I said to go viral," she told a small Dallas outlet. "I said it because it was true." Still, the impact was undeniable. Democratic strategists scrambled to clip the footage into fundraising ads. Activist groups added her words to banners. Young candidates across the country began quoting her in stump speeches. And Ted Lieu, he issued a short statement 2 days later. "I have great respect for Congresswoman Crockett and her service to her constituents," it read. "My intention was never to diminish her accomplishments, but to engage on the importance of qualifications in public office." It was careful, measured, but the tone was different. The arrogance had thinned. The confidence that preceded his question now bent toward recalibration. Back in Washington, the next hearing felt different. Colleagues greeted Crockett with a new respect, some visibly, others in careful, coded silence. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself but leaves a mark. The kind that says, "That moment changed something." In her district, the ripple ran even deeper. In South Dallas, barbershops and breakfast counters buzzed. One woman told her daughter, "She didn't just shut him down. She told the whole world our stories count." A high school student wrote on Instagram, "I've never seen someone talk like that in Congress and mean it. She made space for us." But for Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't a victory lap. It was a signal. She knew what it meant to win a moment and still lose a vote. She knew the difference between applause and power. She lived long enough in rooms where they'd praise her voice and ignore her bill. So she didn't soak in the headlines, she sharpened her focus. Because behind every cheer was a challenge, every retweet was a responsibility. The hearing was over, the clip had gone viral, but the question lingered. Who else would be asked to prove they belonged? Who else would be told their story wasn't enough? And through the noise, a new question emerged. What power does a credential question really hold, and who will define it going forward? This was never just about a single question. It was never just about Jasmine Crockett or Ted Lieu or one exchange on a committee floor. It was about something deeper. It was about the invisible weight of legitimacy, who carries it, who questions it, and who gets crushed beneath it when no one pushes back. When Crockett stood her ground, she didn't just defend herself. She defended the idea that representation is not a privilege, it's a right. That credentials aren't handed down by pedigree, but earned in the trenches of real service. That integrity, consistency, and lived experience are just as valid, sometimes more than any title. Her voice became a vessel for millions who have been asked to justify their existence before they're allowed to speak. For the teacher who gives everything to a struggling district and still gets told she not qualified to lead. For the nurse who organizes for her community but is sidelined in city council meetings. For the activist, the artist, the parent, the worker who knows what needs to be done, but is dismissed because their resume doesn't check the right boxes. Crockett's mic drop wasn't about ego. It was about affirmation. It said, "You belong, even when they try to shrink you, even when they ask in coded language if you're enough." And it was a warning, too. Because the challenge that came from Lieu, calculated, quiet, and familiar, exposed a truth about power. Power that listens builds bridges. But power that doubts first, questions first, gatekeeps first, eventually breaks itself. The more institutions rely on checking credentials over checking conscience, the more they risk erasing the very people democracy was meant to serve. Jasmine Crockett didn't dismantle the system that day, but she reminded it what it was supposed to be. And in doing so, she passed the torch not just to other elected officials, but to anyone who's ever been made to feel like their story wasn't good enough. Because the truth is, your credentials are not always on paper. Sometimes they live in what you've survived, who you've shown up for, what you've built with your own 2 hands when no one handed you the map. You don't need permission to stand tall. You don't need a polished accent or a polished path. What you need is clarity and conviction and the courage to say, "I'm here because my people need me here." That is credential enough. And in that chamber, with cameras rolling and critics watching, Jasmine Crockett gave every underestimated voice a moment of recognition. A moment of vindication. A moment that said, "You are the proof." So when you hear someone ask, "What qualifies you?" remember the answer may define more than a moment. Ted Lieu challenged her. Jasmine Crockett responded. And the country watched as a simple question: what qualifies you to be here? Unraveled into a defining moment about power, voice, and what it truly means to belong in the rooms that shape our future. This wasn't just political theater. It was a reflection of something millions face every day. Being underestimated, being asked to prove yourself over and over again, even after you've done the work, lived the truth, earned your place. What did we learn? That credentials aren't always measured in titles or degrees. Sometimes they're measured in trust, in sweat, in battles fought when no one was watching. That democracy isn't just about who gets elected, it's about who gets respected. Jasmine Crockett's words didn't just silence a moment, they amplified a movement. And now it's your turn. Have you ever been asked to prove yourself when you knew you already had? What credentials do you carry that the world doesn't always recognize? Drop your story in the comments. Let this be a space where lived experience is valued, where voices get heard, where someone else watching sees themselves in you. If this moment hit you, if you felt seen, fired up, or finally understood, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who needs the reminder: you are enough. Join the movement of voices breaking through silence and shaping the future. Because this is bigger than one hearing, bigger than one takedown. It's about reclaiming power from the polished, about reminding America that credentials come in many forms and the most powerful ones don't need permission to exist. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win the exchange. She reminded us what democracy looks like when it listens. And the story isn't over. It's just one chapter in a larger struggle for dignity, truth, and representation, and the next chapter. It starts with us.